This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Okay, welcome back everyone. And it's a great pleasure and honour to do this next session with Nick Payne. Nick Payne is a playwright who has been extremely successful over the last few years in some really wonderful plays. In particular, a series of 3 plays which form a rough trilogy that we'll be talking a little bit about. Constellations in 2012, Incognito in 2014, and Elegy just this year, which in different ways deal with questions about memory, identity, and selfhood. And Nick will, as Catherine did in the last talk, Nick will tell you a little bit about his background rather than me doing it for him. You know more about it. But the reason I'm having a conversation with him today is because for the most recent play, Elegy, which has just finished a run at the Dinosaur warehouse in London, this play involved a couple of people discussing the script as scientific advisors, and I was very, very lucky to be one of those, along with Murray Shanahan, a colleague of mine at Imperial. And interestingly, he had other advisors for this project as well, including former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, which we ended up doing a question and answer session at the Dinosaur just a couple of weeks ago, not that long ago. And what I found remarkable about Elegy, and also about Nick's other work, is really the richness and the depth and the new light that this drama shines on some of the questions that we're interested in today about memory, identity, and self. So the way we want to do this is a little bit informal. I think that whole workshop's kind of supposed to be this nice and informal gathering. So Nick will tell you a little bit about his work and his background, and then we'll have a bit of Q&A, and then we can open it up a bit too. Now I appreciate that's a bit strange, because normally when we would do something like that, we'd be with people who are either about to see the play or have already seen it. So that'll be interesting, but I'm sure there'll be to talk about anyway. So I will hand it over to Nick. Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. Am I right in thinking there are virtually no theatre goers here? Is that right? Okay, good. There's 1, 2.
You've seen?
You saw Elegy, did you? Okay, great. Good. Well, so we'll focus the chat here. Well, okay. I'll give you a brief bio, but only as a bit of context as to sort of why I'm here and I guess what I've done before. But just tell me to hurry up if it's too far off topic. So I started writing plays when I left university, which was about 2006. My first play was done at the Bush Theatre in London in 2009. And sort of since then, really, I've kept writing plays and have had something like roughly 1 play done a year. Mostly in London, I must confess, but a couple of plays have toured the UK. And in fact, Constellations came to Brighton maybe a year or so ago in a touring version. I guess Constellations, which I'll talk about in a bit, was the play that sort of gave me a job as a playwright. Before that, I A, didn't make much money from it, and B, was doing other jobs to make money around writing. So like, I worked in bars and cinemas and theatres and all that sort of stuff. And then Constellations was a bit of a departure. Again, I'll talk about that in a bit more detail. And it was really influenced by science and meeting scientists. In the case of Constellations, it was theoretical physicists and cosmologists. And then Incognito, which came after that, but sort of the sort of germ was in Constellations. And then to Elegy. And I suppose these 3 plays are all about kind of me as someone who is not a scientist and wrapping my head around all these things and a kind of existential crisis. There's nothing tangible about myself. But I'll talk in more detail. So I very rarely, as a writer, I spend most of my time on my own, except when I'm in rehearsal, so it's quite rare that I talk in a room full of people, so I'm afraid I haven't got any slides. But I have written something down, so this is probably only about 10 or 15 minutes, and I'm just going to talk through the process of writing the plays the bits of the science that I was really interested in, and how I wrote and how I worked. So I hope that's okay. I'm conscious of you won't have seen any of the plays, that's absolutely fine. I'll sort of try and describe them a bit. Okay. So, over the last 3, 4, 5 years, I've become increasingly interested in, if not a little bit obsessed with, exploring and investigating scientific ideas through my plays. As we just talked about, Constellations in 2012, Incognito in 2014, and Elegy in 2016. And these 3 plays have attempted to grapple with, amongst other things, free will, determinism, memory, identity, amnesia, the self. Perhaps more broadly, I've been trying to wrestle with what makes us who we are, what constitutes me, what binds or might bind this me here, now, to me tomorrow or me in 50 years' time, and how fragile all of this seems to be. I'd like to talk a little bit then about the process of writing these plays, where my interest in these subjects stems from, and how I've tried to engage with the scientific community in a bid to ensure I don't mangle or misrepresent these ideas too much. I didn't study science beyond GCSE. I studied English at York, and then I moved to London, and as I was saying, I had my first play on in 2009, and in the next sort of 2-3 years, I continued to get plays produced. But during this period, I was writing plays that were by and large domestic. They were set in kitchens and living rooms. They were naturalistic, requiring furniture and costume changes and real-world looking props. For all that I was, I think, trying to recreate real life, the plays often ended up feeling decidedly unreal. There was something artificial about them, and they didn't feel that theatrical either. They didn't feel that imaginative. And as I was thinking about how I might try and move away from naturalism, by pure chance, I stumbled across a documentary, an American documentary series presented by a guy called Brian Greene, professor at Columbia, entitled The Elegant Universe. It was based on his book of the same name. His documentary was an exploration of contemporary theoretical physics, looking at special relativity and general relativity, quantum mechanics, string theory, ongoing search for the so-called theory of everything, and so on. In the final part of his documentary series, Professor Greene touched upon the idea of multiple universes coexisting simultaneously. There isn't just one version of me or of us here living out our lives in this single universe. Rather, so the multiverse theory goes, there are potentially an infinite number of versions of me and us living out different and varied lives across an ensemble of parallel universes. Everything that can happen does indeed happen and is in fact happening right now. To someone who had not studied science for over a decade since I was at school, these ideas were kind of brilliantly discombobulating. I won't go into too much detail as I'm conscious it's a bit off topic, but the more I began to understand about the scientific method in general, the more in love I fell with it. The notion that science could offer an understanding through rigorous and systematic observation and investigation of the world as it is, and not as I anecdotally experienced it, was a welcome revelation. I set about arranging meetings with theoretical physicists and cosmologists to further understand the ideas discussed in the Elegant Universe. I met lots of amazing people, including a couple of people from Sussex, actually, Professor Kathy Romer and Professor Andrew Liddell. The resulting play was a play called Constellations, which was first staged at the Royal Court Theatre in 2012. The play explored the multiverse theory through the prism of a single couple, a cosmologist from Sussex and a beekeeper from London. The form or structure of the play was, I suppose, a bit like the film Groundhog Day. I don't know if people know that film. Right. So scenes in the play were repeated and repeated and repeated and repeated again, with a slight alteration or variation each time. So the cosmologist and the beekeeper would meet and not meet for the first time. They would go on a successful and unsuccessful date. They would move in together and they would not move in together, and so on and so on. It sounds probably unbearable in the way I describe it, but hopefully it was fun to actually see. And although Constellations wasn't explicitly about mind or memory, it was during the year or so I spent researching that play that I stumbled across a curious, perhaps somewhat forgotten nugget of history, the theft of the brain of Albert Einstein, which maybe lots of you know about. So when Einstein died, he was 76 in 1955, and the pathologist tasked with carrying out the Einstein autopsy, a gentleman named Thomas Harvey, removed and procured Einstein's brain and eyes. It remains unclear whether or not Harvey had permission to remove the brain, but remove it he certainly did. Harvey felt it would be short-sighted to leave Einstein's brain to be cremated with the rest of his body. Explaining his actions at the time, Harvey said, "To me it was obvious that the brain of this man should be studied. Here was a brain of genius." Harvey wanted to study Einstein's brain in order to, and I quote, "see the difference between your brain and a genius's." But how or why, I wondered at the time of reading about Harvey, would studying an individual's brain tell you anything about what made that individual an individual? And so, having hugely enjoyed all the research I did on Constellations, I once again decided to try and make contact with a variety of individuals whose work and research was focused on gaining a deeper understanding of the human brain and mind. So I met with Professor Barbara Wilson, who founded the Oliver Zangwill Centre. We discussed, amongst other things, memory loss, traumatic brain injury, confabulation, and you saw earlier that we also discussed chronic amnesiac Clive Waring, with whom Barbara worked, I think, in the 90s. I met with a guy called Professor Narinder Kapoor to discuss memory disorders in more detail, and I spoke with former neuropsychologist and author, a guy called Paul Brox, about the flawed and fragile idea of the self as a linear continuum. Every encounter or conversation led to another encounter and another conversation, or a piece of recommended reading. So Barbara Wilson suggested I read Deborah Waring's book, Exploring Clive's Condition. Paul Brox, I think, though appropriately enough, my memory is a little foggy now, suggested I do a little more reading around the well-known case study of patient HM, and so on and so on. So having struggled to wrap my head around the notion of infinite parallel universes, I had naively assumed that looking into the brain would prove a little more manageable. Of course, in the best possible sense, the brain, the mind, the self, proved even more elusive and labyrinthine than dear old cosmology. In fact, in his preface to The Paradoxical Brain, Narinder Kapoor draws a lovely parallel between cosmology and neuroscience. So Narinder Kapoor says, "Our galaxy, the Milky Way, has thousands of millions of stars, and some commentators have conjectured that the number of stars in the Milky Way may be similar to the number of cells in the human brain. In the past 2 decades, imaging and sensing technologies have transformed both the field of neuroscience and the field of cosmology. Perhaps a more interesting analogy is in the realm of awareness and human consciousness. With our current awareness mechanisms, we are usually only aware of a tiny amount of cognitive activity that mediates human behaviour. Similarly, in the case of cosmology, with our eyes alone, we are only aware of a tiny part of our galaxy. If we were to take our perceptions literally, we would fall for the simple delusion that the sun moved around the Earth." So if my Constellations research had forced me to accept that I was a random collection of atoms operating in a meaningless universe, itself a tiny speck in a vast ocean of meaningless universes, my research into all things neuroscience was now asking me to confront the notion that me, my personality, my continuous self, might in fact be a work of considerable fiction. As Paul Brox, I think, really beautifully puts it in his book, Into the Silent Land, the mental processes underlying our sense of self, feelings, thoughts, memories are scattered through different zones of the brain. There is no special point of convergence, no cockpit of the soul, no soul pilot. They come together in a work of fiction. A human being is a storytelling machine. The self is a story. As a dramatist, the idea that the very fabric of my being might be a work of fiction seemed like a really delightful proposition. No wonder I love telling stories so much, I thought. I'm a story myself. Also, there seemed to be, and I'm conscious this is pretty unscientific, but there seemed to be a number of parallels between the work of the brain and my work in theatre, if not the work of drama and art more generally. Fabrication and confabulation, drawing a number of seemingly disparate elements together in order to provide a holistic present tense experience is the experience I think I'm trying to give an audience in the theatre, as well as, it would seem, the experience my brain is trying to give me. I decided then to simply squash a number of disparate narrative strands into a single play, with the hope of allowing an audience to shape their own individual narrative from these diffuse elements. The resulting play, Incognito, the title pinched from David Eagleman's book of the same name, was performed in the UK in 2014 and was more recently performed off-Broadway in New York earlier this year. In no particular order, the three central story strands of Incognito were a fictionalised account of the life of Thomas Harvey, a fictionalised account of patient HM, and then a fictional take on contemporary neuropsychology. Incognito features over 20 characters, but was written to be performed by a cast of just 4, with each performer playing around 5 or 6 roles. Crucially, the play is performed without any costume or makeup changes, and no naturalistic trappings whatsoever. So one moment a performer would be playing an American pathologist, Thomas Harvey, and then with extreme speed and precision, as if a switch had been flicked, the performer would then transition into playing a fictional character, confabulating amnesiac in present-day London. An audience is more or less given no naturalistic assistance to help navigate what is going on. I tried to inexplicably link form and content. Seemingly divided and discontinuous narrative elements slowly, hopefully slowly begin to make a kind of sense to an audience as the evening progresses. A year or so after writing Incognito, I came across an online news item, which presumably many of you will know about. I didn't, I must confess. Looking at the work of a guy called Dr. Theodore Berger. Dr. Berger and his colleagues from the University of California have created a silicon chip which could be, and I quote, implanted into the brain of a rat to heal or replace damaged brain tissue. In order to do this, Dr. Berger and his colleagues first needed to create a highly complex digital simulation of a particular rat's particular hippocampus. The data from this simulation was then used to develop a mathematical formula which was then programmed into a silicon chip, which was then, yes, implanted into the brain of a rat. As I understood it, Dr. Berger's silicon chip wasn't merely imitating cerebral activity, it was actually able to carry out the very same operation as the destroyed part of the brain it was replacing. This seemed to me to be too tantalizing a development not to try and dramatize. Might there come a time, I wondered, when we will be able to create new memories, or eliminate unwanted memories, or even remember forgotten, presumably lost memories? And if it does become possible to control or augment our memories, will we not fundamentally be altering who we are? Or, to put it another way, when we can augment ourselves to become whomever we wish, then who are we? The existential and ethical risks and implications seem many and varied. The resulting play, Elegy, which, as Anil was saying, we worked on a bit together, was staged at the Donmar Warehouse earlier this year and attempted to grapple with some of these ideas. So just in brief, the play was set in an unspecified near future to give me a bit of scope to make stuff up. And it focused on a married couple in their 60s, Lorna and Carrie, and the dilemma that this couple were facing. So Lorna was suffering from Alzheimer's, and in this near unspecified future of the play, there was a new procedure available, not unlike Dr. Berger's silicon chips, for the treatment of neurodegenerative diseases. The catch, as it were, was that any memories associated with any damaged tissue that is removed in order to make way for the chip or prosthesis would be lost. So Carrie and Lorna met slightly later on in life, in their 40s. So if Lorna opts to undergo this procedure, she will likely lose vast swathes of the memories of her relationship with Carrie. I won't talk about elegy too much because I guess we might talk about it in a moment. There was just one more slightly anecdotal thing I wanted to say, which is I occasionally get asked by journalists where my interest in science comes from. And implicit in their question, or in that kind of question, is a sense or perhaps a belief that drama and or art more generally and science are somehow antithetical. But I really don't believe this. I see parallels all the time between science and art. Between, for instance, the baton passing nature of the empirical method and the process of redrafting a play. You know, each idea or insight a stepping stone to the next. This is me being a bit grand. I know myself once to start reading, but I'll give it a whirl. Science and art are essential human pursuits, wrestling with the essentials of what it means to be human. I'll end with a quote, if that's all right, just because I rather like it, from a book by Alistair McGrath called Inventing the Universe. We cannot limit ourselves to only one method of exploring reality or a single level of description or analysis. Reality is so complicated that we need a series of maps to describe it. No single map is good enough for such an integrated engagement with our world, even though it may be adequate for a particular and limited purpose. No single story can do justice to things. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much for that, Mattia. It's a beautiful piece of stage setting for what we talk about. And I suppose what I wanted to ask you to begin with was, what do you think the act of playwriting, or that choice of form of drama, theatre, can do in exploring these kinds of questions about memory and self and identity that other forms can't so easily?
Yes. I suppose there's a thing you can do on stage, which I guess you can do in novel writing too, but I'm not a novelist, so I don't know enough about that, which is you can embed an audience in the first person experience of a particular character, so that sense cam that we saw, I'd not heard of that before. It's kind of an amazing thing. And so in Incognito, there was a character who I'd say was a fictionalized version of HM. He was also kind of a mashup of Clive Waring. And Clive, as you say, in his diaries, he writes that amazing thing where he says, I'm awake for the first time, and then he scrawls it out, and a moment later he writes the same thing again. And there's a great documentary, I think by Jonathan Miller, Getting This Right, where you see Clive greeting his wife Deborah, and he throws his arms around her, and he says something like, forgive me, I'm paraphrasing, like, oh my God, it's so amazing to see you. And then within seconds, he'll do exactly the same thing again. And it sounds like an obvious thing to say, but as in the next bit, sounds like an obvious thing to say. I essentially took that and put it in Incognito. And what happens to an audience when they see that repeated again and again and again and again, to the point of almost attrition, their perspective completely shifts. So the first time they see that, they generally find it quite funny. They go, oh, who's this funny guy greeting this woman who they don't yet know who she is, with such a kind of delight and a thrill and an excitement. And then as the play goes on and they understand what, the condition the character is suffering from, they, in a way, almost switch perspective, and they're sort of with the character of Deborah in the scene, if you know what I mean. They sort of understand what it means for someone to live with that, where the relationship, say, between a husband and wife in that scenario cannot develop in a way. The love is clearly there, and it's deep and it's profound and as real as it was suffering from any kind of amnesia. But you can sort of give the audience the visceral first-person experience of what it means to live with that. And I guess similarly in something like Elegy, even though the drama is the dilemma, is a total fiction, you're still kind of getting an audience to grapple with, I hope anyway, through that dilemma, the basics of, what makes you you, what makes the person you are with or love them, and what makes you a sort of collective remembered unit, and how fragile that is. Another person I met for Elegy was a bioethicist. Deborah Bowman, yes. And and stop me again if you all know this, and she does an amazing thing when she works in hospitals, mediating essentially disputes between clinicians and families in cases where it's just a kind of unresolvable thing, I suppose. And so Deborah is brought in because she's such a kind of amazing, cool, calm person. And she gives this one example, which is a kind of tiny thing, but I think like in micro is an amazing example of something where, so there was a woman in hospital who had very severe Alzheimer's, and she'd been a vegetarian all her life, and in fact she campaigned for sort of animal rights. And then at a certain point in her condition, she started demanding meat. She said, I really want a steak, another steak dinner. And her family said to the hospital, you cannot feed her meat. That's not who she is. She would not want that. But the hospital was saying, look, we have to respect the wishes of the patient. And so someone like Deborah was brought in to essentially kind of broker, I'm conscious out of context, it sounds a bit silly, but to broker whether or not this woman was allowed to have a steak dinner. But it was kind of an amazing thing where you see a family through grief or for whatever having to go, the person they thought that woman was, that they thought she was her entire life, she might now not be.
Well, that's interesting because you said the question of whether this woman is allowed to eat steak, where it's assuming that's the idea that there is that continuity between them. Yeah. And of course that comes up in Elegy as well, doesn't it? One of the things that happens in Elegy is a lot of discussion about lasting power of attorney and who has decision making. So the ethics seems to be something that drama can do then that science. Yeah. Do you think the science is sort of running ahead of some of the ethical questions?
I think that's interesting. Maybe. I mean, it's an interesting one sort of in hospitals where you're having to deal with, those kind of end-of-life decisions, say, and maybe in the case of a neurodegenerative condition or something where, I don't know, in my thankfully smallish experience with that kind of thing, consultants in hospitals might not have a terribly good grasp of how to discuss the emotional fallout, either with the patient of what they're going through or with the families in terms of what the patient is going through. And again, I suppose through fiction, you can absolutely put an audience collectively right in the centre of that dilemma, I guess.
I mean, seeing Elegy and knowing about the previous plays, one thing that strikes me is you make the actors really work hard. And I mean, you get some incredible people in your plays. The Elegy had a Zoe Wanamaker as one of the main characters. You had Jake Gyllenhaal acting in your
Constellations in New York. Yes.
But and in Incognito you have people swapping characters rapidly. I mean, is that something that you deliberately want to impose on them? Why do you make them?
I say make them work. Well, I mean, the funny thing is, I sort of, no one understands, I think, being incognito more than actors. Like, they spend their life being in character. And even that, when you really think about it, is a slightly, I mean this in the most kind of loving way, it's a slightly ridiculous thing. And they spend their time in rehearsal sort of crafting out a linear character, you know what I mean? So they'll go through, they'll create a biography, and they'll go, this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and that makes this person this kind of person because of everything that happened to them. And I suppose in a way, I just decided to make that explicit in the forms of the play. You know, so in Constellations, repeating things again and again and again. All you do in rehearsal for almost to the point of boredom is you just repeat the same bit again and again. So whether they're rehearsing some Shakespeare play or whatever, you know, it's about repetition. And I guess actually it's an act of memory, and it's an act of kind of muscle memory of getting it into your body. So yeah, in Constellations, I just made that explicit. You know, they just did the same stuff over and over again.
And so, staying with ethics a bit, in Elegy again, you had also some discussions with the former Archbishop Rowan Williams. So how did that come about, and what influence did that have on play? I remember actually he was there after this Q&A. He stayed to watch it, and there are some lines in Elegy, I think, where people can be a little bit irreverent, and I think everyone was watching to see if there was a reaction from it.
Yeah, there was a line about. So one of the characters in the play, the character who is not ill, has some kind of religious conviction. Was at one point faithful, I suppose, and she's through having to care for her partner. That sort of dissipates, I guess. And I suppose I was interested as I was trying to wrap my head around, like, what is faith from a scientific or from a neuroscientific point of view? Like, what is love, or you know, those slightly general questions. And I guess I wanted to get another view, like, what would he say? So I knew someone who knew him, Josie Rourke, who's the artistic director of the Donmar, and I rather sheepishly went to he's now in Cambridge, and I went to his house, and he just had the Dalai Lama to say, actually. Incidentally, the Dalai Lama loves sausages. Yeah, and he said the Dalai Lama loved playing with Rowan Williams' eyebrows. He has got really impressive eyebrows. If you've ever seen him up close. And so of course I must confess I'm not religious. I sort of said to Rowan, like, okay, what is faith? Like, where do you think faith resides in the brain? Like, where's the faith bit of the brain? And he's I don't know what you thought about that Q&A, but he's an extraordinary man, and he's exceptionally clever, and he seems like a sort of thinker in an old-fashioned sense, like he actually just sits with himself in silence for sort of a bit of his day to just contemplate. So of course when I said, where's faith in the brain, he said, well, you're using the sort of wrong language, like I can't, you're not, we can't have the discussion on those terms because faith sits outside the terminology you're using, or the sort of, even the method you're using to try and describe it. It's greater than that, you know. So there was a line in the play, which again is sci-fi really, of course, where somebody said, in this future world where you can mess with memory, that if you removed every memory of faith, if you took out every memory of an act of faith, or every memory of anything tied to faith, that you'd remove the memory of faith, you'd remove belief in its totality. And he of course said, that's rubbish. You would, faith is bigger than that. It would live in you somewhere in an intangible way that science will never be able to, or not will never, but is currently not quite able to grapple with it.
So how then all the plays that we've mentioned, this trilogy of plays, they've all sort of started from what you seem to describe as some almost serendipitous encounter, stumbling across an article here, a paper there.
Yeah.
But as a whole, they seem remarkably coherent in dealing with issues of self-memory and identity. So I'm just wondering, how does this process happen for you? Is it really you stumble across something and then take it forward, and how do you include the science generally in the picture? You've said a little bit there with Elegy, but that's the first time. So do you set it aside at some point, or at what point do you say, okay, well that's interesting, and now I'm going to move on, I'm going to go off, and how far do you think you can go?
Yeah, I think, as I say, because I suppose a lot of the job is on your own, I enjoy the bit of the social bit of it, even though playwrights are generally quite awkward people. I include myself in that. I sort of really like getting out of the office and going to meet people, and of course getting to meet people like you, or like Deborah, or like anyone I've mentioned is an amazing thing, like people who are experts in their field. And they, as far as I can tell, they don't mind me asking really banal, basic questions and saying, please explain this incredibly complicated thing to me. And I really love doing that. And I think if I'm going to do something in a play that is inaccurate or is a kind of bastardization of the truth, as it were, I want to know that I'm doing that consciously rather than it being a mistake. So in Elegy, for instance, the way this procedure with this chick deals, sort of robs someone of memory. Of course, I was aware that memory is a much more holistic process that exists, as that quote from Paul Brock says, I think, like all over the brain holistically. But for the purposes of the play, I slightly had to awfully simplify it in order to, for better or worse, to get this dilemma within the play to work. But ordinarily, I try to be, as it were, as sort of faithful as I can.
That was interesting, because that indeed is, that's the one, so that's something in Elegy that is not the case, that it's not the case that you can remove a bit of the hippocampus and then you remove X years of memory. But on the other hand, you were very, very careful to make sure whether it was GABA or glutamate.
Yes. Yes, it's true. And Alzheimer's, I mean, of course, awfully, Alzheimer's does not progress chronologically on any of the dementias. Like, it doesn't sort of, respectfully rob you of your years in reverse chronology. The awful thing, of course, is that it takes from anywhere in a sort of awfully random fashion. But again, for the purposes of the play, I simplified what the illness to a degree, so that in essence, these two women who met later on in life, that they would be losing the whole of the life they spent with each other, rather than, otherwise I guess it becomes quite a convoluted dilemma. Like, you might lose a bit from this year, but you'll lose this bit from when you were 5. So no, there's things like that you have to, you don't have to, but at least if I'm going to do it, I want to know that I'm actively choosing to do that rather than just getting it wrong.
Okay. I think before I open it up a little bit, I just wanted to ask you, actually I wanted to ask you Catherine's question. So, I am, and what would it be?
Probably Playwright. Yes, I am a playwright.
And the memories that come along with that?
What were they? They were linked to playwriting. It was two memories linked to what you say you are. I don't know, God. I was really interested in the reminiscence part, because I almost can't remember anything from my teenage years, which I thought is probably a bad sign. I suppose I think it's not really linked to the topic, but I vaguely remember the first moments of playwriting where I thought, I could do this for a job, And it was probably when Constellations, having gone on at the Royal Court in a sort of smallish theatre, about 100 seat, it transferred to the West End, and that was a moment where I sort of went, oh, okay, I can probably do this for a living.
Well, I think you've certainly established that. It's, I have to say that having seen Elegy a couple of times now, it's really one of the most powerful theatrical experiences I've had, and it's so vivid and conveys, because the acting is great, also the tragedy of memory loss and the ethical dynamics are absolutely wonderful. So if you do get a chance, is it going
it's finished, but hey, buy the published play text, why not?
Really remarkable stuff. Thanks so much,
Thanks.
Nick. Is there, again, conscious that people haven't seen the play, but it's obviously there's lots more general things we've been talking about how art, science, and interact in this particular sphere. Is there any questions that we can open it up to anybody else? Shannon?
So you've got this theme, which is fictional creation of the self, the essential self. If you had to kind of say, what's the message that you're trying to deliver behind that? What are the moral kind of implications of that of that no essential self? Just kind of with this cube.
Yeah. It's funny, you know what? I think I'm probably too. I think in a way I try to pose the question as clearly as I can, rather than necessarily provide a moral or a sort of answer through the plays. But there was one thing I was really interested in, and it's only briefly there in Incognito, which was automatism, and non-insane automatism, or I get this right, please correct me. So there was a case of a man who was sleepwalking and he murdered his wife for whatever it is, 30 years. He'd been on antidepressants, I think, came off and had this episode, and he was acquitted through that defence. I found that really fascinating, that the law now has an exception for not being you when you're otherwise you. And yeah, there was a tiny flicker of it in Incognito, but anyway, I'm slightly going away from your question, but I think I try to go for the sort of question or the dilemma of the thing, rather than necessarily, I mean, my God provides an answer, I wouldn't know how. But also, I don't know, to, as it were, me, not a scientist, and I guess lots of the audience who come probably not, you know, it's both a sort of, potentially, if they enjoy it anyway, it's a bracing realisation, I think, to realise that the idea of you is tied to such fragile stuff, and an injury or an illness can rob you of you, and rob everyone else you love of you. And I think when people get that, I suppose there is a sort of weirdly affirming thing about it. Maybe it's also a bit cathartic.
Yeah, I think, I found it. They are quite dark, aren't they? On the face of it.
It's funny. I thought Elegy maybe had more gags, but no. In the end, it was quite a dark thing. Incognito was a bit funny, I think, because all the stuff around Einstein's brain, I don't know, you couldn't really play that seriously because it was quite ridiculous. The sort of Clive Wearing-inspired character. I mean, he was such a kind of. He really did seem to have, I don't know, forgive me, I'm probably using inaccurate, but like remnants of his personality was all completely intact. And likewise, H.M. The book by Suzanne Corkin, do people know that? Permanent Present Tense? Beautiful, and the way she describes it, this amazing thing of when they say, "How did you sleep, Henry?" And he'd say something like, "Tell you the truth, I didn't stay awake to find out." And apparently he said it his whole life. He's repeated that gag, and of course he did. But it's kind of amazing, that survived. Anyway, so there were maybe like moments of brevity in others, but Elegy was a bit more of a dark thing.
What are you working on now?
Well, I just adapted a book for a film, which is also about memory, actually. The Sense of an Ending by Julian Barnes. Do you know that book? Which is, about a guy in his 60s who sort of has, I guess, unwittingly, or maybe wittingly, self-mythologized a particular event in his past to make himself a sort of victor of his own autobiography, and actually very badly. That's been made into a film. It was shot in the UK, and then I'm writing some telly.
So have you had any of these other inspirational moments, like you describing, you have these chance things that you then got? Are you working on anything like that?
Well, so I read, when you were talking about music earlier, I just finished that Oliver Sacks book, it's called Musicophilia, and there's amazing descriptions of kind of music therapy in that, and people who, forgive me, I can't remember the term now, when they suffers, say, a traumatic head injury and are sort of unable to speak.
Well, that would be so vegetative state, or
Well, no, so they're sort of functional. Yes, aphasia, and they, through music therapy, although they can't speak, they can't do sort of improvised speech, they can't have a conversation, they teach them to have conversations through singing lines of songs. So they'll sing like a line of a Beyonce track, and that's how they'll communicate. As he describes it, he doesn't describe Beyonce as film, but and I thought, that's amazing. Like, if there was a way of dramatising that, doing something with language, you know, like when you take it away and you have to rehabilitate to get language working again. Again, in terms of that, putting an audience in the experience, in the dynamic, you know, presenting them with a character who has that taken away and I don't know.
What would you have done if you were Carrie?
Would I have done?
So Carrie's the one
Yeah, so in the play, his character's Carrie and Lorna. Lorna says, I don't want that, I'm not having that done to me. But Carrie, Lorna, before she gets very unwell, gives Carrie lasting power of attorney. So Carrie, her wife, wants to have a procedure, even though at a certain point in her history, her wife made it clear she can't do it. I'd probably do it, if it kept the person alive, particularly if they were younger. And you might get to know them again.
what would you have done?
I wouldn't.
You wouldn't have done.
Wouldn't have done it. That's so interesting. Really? Yeah.
Peggy?
The way that you're talking about your plays, and I apologize for not having seen them, but I definitely want to see them now, is as if you're giving people like a vicarious experience, like it's showing them like firsthand somebody else's life. But I wonder if you thought about also whether people may be bringing their own memories and how, this type of like a theater kind of experience, the interaction there.
Well, I think invariably, in each of the plays, there's also been a thing about death or mortality or grief or sort of, is also coursing through them all a bit, I think.
That was going to be one of my questions, actually. Are all your plays about
death? Yes, they are. I'm obsessed. Get over it. I know. I need to move on. And I think, people will inevitably bring their sort of own experience of going through that. So in Elegy, the disease that the character has is never named explicitly. You're never told it's Alzheimer's or vascular dementia or whatever. It's sort of described a bit, and at one point you see some symptoms of it. But of course, anyone who was watching it who had been through that, or had lived through that with someone they knew or loved, would really pick up on that in a way that I don't necessarily think it's a play about a neurodegenerative disease. In fact, one guy actually was quite angry because he was like, "You've made up, this solution." He said it's bullshit. Which is fair enough, he's right, it is, I made it up, it's not true. And he sort of couldn't get over his rage of having, I don't know what he'd been through, he wasn't that explicit, but. And Constellations similarly was sort of, one of the characters ends up becoming very ill. So in a play that's sort of where everything is possible, it's sort of, as the play goes on, possibilities sort of collapses. I think, people again who have been through a bereavement will often gravitated towards that bit of the story.
One last question.
So you talked about the extension of the self over time and how stable it is. And you've obviously spent a lot of time around actors. Do you think that they're basically trying on new selves?
What, through like the more roles they do?
When they have a character, is it a new self?
Well, I tell you, it's so interesting how, I don't per se know enough about the history of acting to know this, but the sort of contemporary thing of a Christian Bale or a Tom Hardy, who they physically transform themselves for their roles, I think it is really, like it is telling, like the psychoanalysts that have a field day with that stuff, I'm sure. It is very interesting that they, that there is a certain kind of actor who thrives on being a comedian, on the comedic bit of the job of bulking up, slimming down, and learning a voice. And there are some actors who, possibly Simon Russell Beale, who was mentioned earlier, who I would say isn't per se a comedian. kind of get a bit of him in everything. It's kind of him. So yeah, it is very interesting. I honestly don't know where that comes from. I don't know enough about the impulse to lose yourself in fiction to such a degree that you know, Daniel Day-Lewis, that you know, I sort of, that can't be true. You can't really stay in character. You know, and he really does. On the call sheet for Lincoln, so the sheet that gets stuck up on the, you know, on the wall every day, which is when everybody's coming in. Sorry, forgive me if I'm saying something you'll know. It says Mr. Lincoln. No, it doesn't say Mr. Day-Lewis. It's Mr. Lincoln. On set, you have to call him Mr. Lincoln. You know, he's sort of, he really. But I tell you what is really interesting about that. Sorry, this is a bit of a tangent, but just so I don't sound like a bad man here, which I'm not. Film is so boring and monotonous, and an actor shoots maybe for like 2 hours a day, for a 10-hour day. For the rest of that day, they're doing nothing. They're just waiting. So, funnily enough, when I went on set for Sense of an Ending, I sort of got why you stay in character. Because in a way, if you break it, it must be impossible to get back to that place where you're sort of in it and you're, you know, ready. And the pressure when the camera and the lights are all set up and you have to wander into the environment and just deliver instantly, I think is huge. So it does seem a bit silly, but I sort of get it.
Great. Okay. Thank you. I could go on, but we have to really.
Yeah, of course.
Thank you so much.